Okay, time right now is 1 p.m. I don't have any guests yet. I'll just wait a minute in case some people come in. Oh, we have one person just came in. Mark, hello. Pleasure to meet you. I'm just waiting a minute to see if suddenly a bunch of people come in. This time slot was moved a bit, so I don't know if the link just suddenly came up or anybody's confused or who knows what. So I'll just wait a moment.
Yeah, sure, no problem.
We have another person that just came in. Welcome. So yeah, we're going to be starting in just a moment here. This presentation is designing an intensive reading lesson. And I'll just say hello, myself. My name is Garrett DeHond. I am a assistant professor at Weidei's Department of English Linguistics and Language Technology. Intensive reading is a class I've had to teach in the past here at Weidei. So in recent years, I've been reading about this topic just a bit more to make sure that I'm running that kind of class appropriately. And I just thought it might be something that's interesting to others. So we'll just sort of get into it. We don't have a lot of people. So if you guys want to just either jump in every once in a while to ask a question or just type something into the chat, you can certainly do that. And yeah, besides that, let's go ahead and get started. Let's start with the Fox and the Grapes. Everybody knows Fox and the Grapes, right? Certainly Fox and the Grapes is something that is pretty famous to people. This is taken from the Library of Congress. Maybe you have younger students whom you want to give short readings to and introduce something like Aesop's Myths. But of course, you're going to run into situations where maybe students aren't familiar with all of the language here, or you want to develop certain reading strategies for Fox and the Grapes or anything else. I'm just using this just to frame the discussion. And when you get into that kind of situation, you start doing what good teachers do. You start thinking about your objectives for the class and that lesson, how much frequency or time that you have, homework that you're going to give, the text itself that's being studied, any number of things that we start considering. But one thing to consider at the end of the day is that if you are assigning the Fox and the Grapes or anything to somebody to read, and everybody's going through the same reading and you have specific objectives, you might start entertaining what's going to be an intensive reading lesson. So I hope that you get some ideas for your class out of what follows with the presentation here. So let's just sort of define what intensive reading might mean here. So in an intensive reading lesson, the instructor or teacher is the one who is selecting the text, maybe with student input. Students are approaching the readings in very similar parameters. They have the same amount of time to go through the reading. You're giving them certain types of exercises or assessments. And there are certain expectations that you have as you lead the activity. You might be having certain items of emphasis, such as linguistic features or content dimensions. Like in this case, this is a myth that we are looking at. So that genre would be an example of a content dimension, or any types of reading strategies that you want your students to be practicing. And as you are making assessment considerations, you're probably focusing on things like student comprehension, reading development throughout the class or within a particular item of text, reading efficiency. And there are other ones that we'll be talking about a little bit later. So a lot of that is intensive reading. And in a lot of cases, you might be doing something like intensive reading already in your classes, depending on how you go about introducing your text. And one quick thing that I'll say as we continue from this point on is that a lot of the ideas that I'm sharing with you today are coming from a couple of sources that I've used, such as Teaching Readers of English, which is a Hedgecock and Ferris book, and then also Teaching and Researching Reading, which is William Grabe, I think, Grabe and Stoller, excuse me. So if you want, you might want to consider looking those up on Book Depository or any websites where you can get a good affordable book and be able to use that to your advantage. So Many IR researchers consider a three-stage process when it comes to intensive reading. The one that you see here on the slide is taken from the CSU Expository Reading and Writing Task Force. Here is another good link right here from lumenlearning.com, which has academic reading strategies. If you check out either of these, you might get a lot of ideas in terms of how you want to be creating those stages yourself. But one thing that is generally in agreement is that there is a pre-reading phase, a reading phase, and a post-reading phase when it comes to activities. And for this presentation, I'm going to follow these items that you see highlighted pretty closely. If you look at the other website I just shared with you a moment ago, you'll see pretty similar stuff on there as well. How you visit these stages are up to you. It depends on your class, how much time you have to meet, etc. Certainly, you want to be thinking about how you're changing your practices over time to emphasize new strategies or to practice older ones. So that way we're getting to the point where students are approaching automaticity in what they're doing with their reading practice. So let's start with what you are doing before students actually read the text. And as far as getting ready to read, how are you activating and developing their schema, and how are you establishing purpose for the read? So if we're thinking about Aesop's fables, students are probably going to be familiar with what a fox is, or you can have it already translated for them depending on whatever level you're working with. Maybe quite a few of them will be familiar with whom Aesop is. So being able to discuss that and also try to find situations where maybe you need to discuss that a bit more is going to be to your advantage. And then why are we reading Aesop's Fox and the Grapes in the first place? What do we want to practice when we're reading Fox and the Grapes or anything else is something that you want to not only be considering before you design the lesson itself, but you want to be introducing to the students so that way they can be effective readers when they start going through the reading. So when you're doing that, you're going to be getting them to survey the text. And a lot of what you see right here are strategies that you already might be doing. Like, for example, many of you might be trying to get your students to look at the title of the text, to look at any photographs, to look at contrast and typography, such as keywords. All of that before getting started is going to be to their advantage. And it also gives a point of discussion, if you'd like, before students start reading together. So we have all these strategies here. Notice that these are sort of for like any text to a certain degree, but we're talking about Fox and the Grapes that doesn't have an introduction to conclusion. So some of these might vary in emphasis, but essentially, how have you examined the obvious items? Have you checked out how it begins and ends? Have you sampled the beginnings of body paragraphs? How are you using skimming and scanning? And can you outline the macro structure of the text from your quick survey is something that is to students' benefit to practice. And at this point, hopefully students can either be trained to or begin to start thinking about what the text is going to be. So investigating their own knowledge gaps, making predictions, questioning meaning, drawing inferences would all be examples of things we want students to do before we get started. And many of you might be familiar with all sorts of different strategies to get that going. As a couple of quick ideas, getting students to complete a KWL chart or a SQ3R, I almost said 3QSR, excuse me, or a REAP or PQRST charts would be something that is useful for this stage and also for the stages that we're going to be talking about a little bit later on. And obviously, all of those, you can just do a Google image search and find all sorts of great examples online. One more thing to talk about before they actually do the reading itself is getting students to think about vocabulary, designing the lesson to be able to emphasize vocabulary that you want to teach them. So when you look at any readings that you have, are there any words that are highlighted or jargony or maybe unfamiliar to your average learner or anything like that that you would like to introduce in the text? When I look at the fox and the grapes, I might think to myself, well, maybe scornfully, scornful is something that's going to be a little bit unfamiliar to students. Maybe the word bunch in this case is not something that they're familiar using. In this case, bunch is talking about a bunch of grapes, right? So anything along those lines is to your advantage to consider actively as you're designing the lesson and then introducing it to students. I like to sort of train students to be using tools during lessons or on their own. So getting them to get onto a recommended dictionary, thesaurus website, translation app, any of those things is certainly something that I would recommend. And students can often do that themselves, especially the older that they are. But if you have trusted sources that you want to be using regularly in classes, it creates like a certain familiarity that helps you and them. So like I use the Lonman dictionary for some lessons because of its many features. It has good pronunciation of things. Is it going to work?
Scornful.
There it is. It also, if it is, it sometimes breaks down academic word list items and has other features that I like. And I often use Pagogo for English to Korean translation. Of course, it's not perfect, but no translator is. But I like to have students automatically be considering these kinds of options. It also would be to your benefit to have some kind of vocabulary profile that you can create regularly, and maybe using tools yourself, or in some cases, having students use those tools. I have a bunch of different items that I could recommend to you right now. We have Vocab Grabber, which is not working on my Brave browser, I'm finding out today, but it was working on Microsoft Edge. So if you put in the text here and grab vocabulary, you can get a little word cloud and some other items here. Lesson Writer is not simply for vocabulary, but it has an automated tool that allows you to pull some vocabulary out as well as design other lessons. You need to create an account for them, but they do have a free and paid version that I think the free version is pretty useful. We have a couple of vocabulary profilers like LexTutor, which will be able to draw out frequency words, will be able to draw K1 and K2 academic word list words and such. Vocabulary Profiler from the University of Hong Kong has a similar function, which you can see right here. And one last profiler that I'll recommend is something called Analyze My Writing, where you can get basic text statistics, common words and phrases, readability, and some other items. So I just think that if you're going to want to teach vocabulary for your intensive reading lessons, you sort of go a little bit out of your way to make sure that you can profile the vocabulary yourself and actively think about how you're going to use and introduce that to students in your class. So let's get to the reading. So sometimes called the during phase. And when it comes to intensive reading, it's recommended you do a minimum 2, that you try to either assign students to complete or train them to do on their own. And each time they read, they should have some kind of explicit objectives that they're trying to complete with those readings. Generally, for the first reading, you want to focus on comprehension. Do you students understand the gist of the reading and the main points? Have you been able to confirm your predictions? Do you have any unanswered questions that you have already put down in your before reading, etc.? You can teach students to take different types of progress notes, especially if it's a longer reading. You can sort of train them to try to read within a certain phase of time, or to record and see how long it takes them. You could even encourage read alouds, and you can have students actually do that. And there are also websites out there that are pretty good these days as far as text to speech, like this website here, TTS Reader, which I got to tell you, I didn't know this until recently, but not only does text-to-reader have some English options, but apparently there is a Korean pronunciation option, which I'll just play for you real quick, just to give you an idea of what that's like.
The Fox and the Grapes. A fox one day spied a beautiful bunch of ripe grapes hanging from a vine trained along the branches of a tree.
Did you guys catch that? Were you able to hear that okay? Okay, cool. So that was just an interesting discovery. I don't have much comment on what you can do with that in the classroom, but it's there. And of course, you can have both male and female, UK and US voices with this website, and you could find other similar websites out there. But getting back to the slide, when it comes to that first reading, do you get it is essentially what you want your students to be automatically trained for. They should not be dissecting the text quite yet. That could be an option in the additional readings. And when you look at the website I shared earlier from lumenlearning or the books that I shared, they usually talk about this in terms of assigned 2 readings. And I think that's completely credible. But there can also be circumstances where you're trying to train students to do more than 2, maybe 3 or 4 for some reason. But there should always be a reason. And so when it comes to the second or any additional readings, think about what you want students to either do in the class or train them to do on their own. Monitoring and ensuring comprehension and practicing reading strategies that you are teaching in the class would be part of that. Doing things like comprehension checks, guiding questions, outlining, highlighting and annotating, questioning and responding can all be taking place during these additional readings. And what you're going to get to is a situation where sometimes you're going to want them to think about the language of the text, and sometimes you're going to want them to think about the structure of the text. So these are just some quick ideas that I've thrown up here, but this doesn't mean that this is a limited list, nor does it mean you have to do all of these in any particular way. But again, when it comes to language, if you want students to improve with their language, how are you getting them to revisit any special words or terms? How are you getting them to make notes about things that are not very familiar to them? Checking against a vocabulary profile, interrogating any cohesion in the items that they're looking at, or comparing different types of syntactic and stylistic choices to their own grammar experience. The complexity of this is going to change dramatically for your different circumstances. So here at Weidei's department, I do something a little bit more intensive in the classes that I have taught because students want to use English professionally. But some of you are teaching in elementary school or Hagwon, and you're going to find that you're going to want to do something a little bit of a more simplified version of any of this. And then when it comes to when I mean structure concerned objectives, how are students able to determine the rhetorical context or how it was published? How are they comparing to different genre expectations? Examining any transitions from idea to idea, comparing ideas to the title, to the subheadings, or even to other things like the pictures. And then considering the weight of information, like when you go back to the Fox and the Grapes item that I shared, the fact that when we look at this, we see that we have these items organized near the bottom as these sort of standalone, 1 or 2 sentence items, whereas the earlier ones are longer. What does that matter to students in terms of any of the objectives you have discussing myths would be an example of what I'm talking about here. And so now that takes us to the after. And this is probably something that's going to be really familiar to a lot of you because you want to think about what students can show you from their readings. But hopefully you'll get a couple of extra ideas out of this as well. How are your students able to summarize and respond to the readings should be an early concern in terms of assessing what they can do after they finished. So in this case, summarizing means being able to recall and put it into their own words. any types of short burst recall strategies that you have, practicing with any particular items, or comparing inside the text or to other texts would be examples of this. And then what I mean by responding here is how they connect to their own experiences. Do they like or dislike? How do they find this useful? These would be examples of response writing. Of course, it doesn't have to be response writing. It could be discussion as well. But that's what I'm getting at when it comes to summary and response. And I think that even if you don't always assess summary or response in any of your reading lessons, it's prudent that they're trained on these kinds of strategies before you get to the next two that I'm going to talk about, which is critical thinking and reader writing connections, because they are quite useful to go to those next phases. So a lot of ways we can describe critical thinking, but essentially in this sense, IR researchers will say that critical thinking comes out of your ability to summarize and respond to a text for the purpose of evaluation for any particular types of qualities. And right here in the PPT, I have some like pretty generic types of critical thinking questions that one could be asking regularly in many of their readings. Obviously, you can tailor them to the readings as well. One thing that I hope you consider doing as far as throwing some critical thinking questions at students is how you're designing them to get students to think about what they've done in the earlier stages. So if you are pushing note-taking strategies on your students, are your questions designed in a way to get them to refer to their notes? If you gave them an activity that has a graphic organizer, like a KWL chart, how are you explicitly referring back to that in the lesson design that you've created? And one more item after that is reading and writing connections. So at this phase, we're trying to get the reader to connect to other ideas that they have, but they can also get and discuss with other sources. So having students go online to discuss these what they've learned with other people, or going to a search engine to look things up would be examples of reading writing connections. In engaging others in the class with this would be the same thing. So maybe what I might do if I have students read The Fox and the Grapes is I might have students try to learn more about this famous myth. Or I might have students try to learn more about Aesop and Aesop's fables. Or just to do something a little bit different, I might try to ask students to tell me about myths that they have in their native culture related to foxes, like the nine-tailed fox, which is pretty well known in Korean, Chinese, and Japanese folklore. Okay, how can we compare these two different types of myths? Are there any interesting similarities or differences that we want to discuss? So any types of items such as discussion, comprehension questions, language review, and even something more intense like a research project would certainly be credible assessment options that would make sure students are doing decent reading, writing connections. One thing to consider is how you're getting your students to explore these comparisons with other text types or topics. So if you're having them read a myth, are you having them look at any other myths by Aesop or by other persons? Are you asking them during that before phase about their experiences with myths and folklore in the past, other fables? Anything along those lines would be something that would be an example of getting students to actively make those connections. So I'm going a little bit fast, I think, but did anyone want to ask any questions before I get to some like suggestions and other things? Pretty good for the moment. I was just checking my my chat list here as well. So let me talk about some suggestions I have for making this a little bit easier and a little bit more interesting for you. First of all, recognizing that intensive reading is not extensive reading, and that's perfectly okay. Some of you are probably big proponents of extensive reading, or it's something that you've been wanting to investigate. And one of the things that I sort of hinted at in my abstract for this, and that I'll just sort of say right now, is that intensive reading is work reading. It's work. If you can make it an interesting lesson, if you can incorporate pleasure reading into the intensive reading lesson, that's great, so long as you can meet those other objectives we've been talking about. But extensive reading is essentially having students locate their own texts to a certain degree, engaging in something that's interesting, and then getting into more complex activities from there. Intensive reading is a little bit more of a careful examination of a text and doing it within a community of other learners who are doing the same thing. So I think either way is fine, depending on what you're trying to accomplish with the class, but you just want to recognize that you're going to be using very different strategies in many cases, and there are also going to be different demands as a result. As you start doing your design and start trying to incorporate intensive reading lessons into your class, you're going to start coming across different types of constraints in terms of what you can do, how much time you have, et cetera. And your students are going to come across that too. A good example of that might be in the intensive reading class that I led. I had students do some timed readings for the purposes of discussion. And some students could read well in 10 minutes, whereas others needed some more time. So how are you adjusting for that is an important thing to consider. But also, how are you getting students to reflect on their own reading habits? So that way it's like, oh, I took this long to go through my first reading. Why is that the case? Is it because I needed a little bit more time to access the vocabulary that I was looking at? Or was I distracted by other strategies, such as trying to look up words on my phone or whatever? Getting students to think about that is actually going to make the process a little bit more fluid for them and for you as you try to interact on the lesson items that you've prepared. If you can, adapt to the language complexity or difficulty. If you have a book for your class, obviously that's harder. In my classes, it's just my preference to do lessons with online text. And there are a couple of reasons for that. I don't want my students to pay for things. And I can just, with the classes that I teach, I have the luxury of just choosing my own curriculum. So I'm lucky in that sense. Therefore, when I take something from the web, I'm going to sort of look at it a little bit, consider how complex it is for my students, but then maybe consider adapting it a little bit to fit their needs. If you can do that, I think that's a good consideration. If we go back to the Fox and the Grapes example that I showed, some of you might be thinking, well, for the young children that I teach right now, scornfully is just not a word that they should be learning yet. And if you have good reason to think that, that's fine. What might you use instead? Where did I leave off here? Consider how you are holding your students accountable for the before and during reading phases that I said a moment ago. So again, as a reminder, we have this pre-reading stage, this actual reading stage, and then this post-reading stage. And it's pretty easy for us as teachers to fall into assessment and accountability in that after stage. So it's like, okay, you did the reading, so now respond to it, please. Answer these comprehension and critical thinking questions, please. And sure, that's something that's necessary. But if you don't at all consider before and during stages for how you are doing some formative or informal assessments, then you might get into a situation where you're actually not ensuring that the students are doing that. So if you want them to do readings in a certain way, your after reading considerations are probably not going to be good enough to ensure that they're doing that. Okay, so anything along the lines of having them do like a quick recall from the first reading, or having them highlight words that they struggled with as they are reading, are some quick examples of holding students accountable for those stages, getting them to do that with some automaticity, like I mentioned earlier. Reconceptualize what your LMS can do for you. If you have a really good LMS like Moodle or Canvas or other ones where there are a lot of neat functions to them, sometimes you have add-ons to that LMS that can help you in a lot of interesting ways. Especially, I actually put this PPT together for a previous colloquium I did before COVID-19 happened. And then now we've been online all year in the case of many of us. So how you have done discussions has probably transformed compared to what you might have done in the traditional classroom, or not, depending on the person. But as far as trying to get students to interact with each other, your various LMS tools might have a lot of neat functions that allow you to get students to show what they've done with intensive reading. So a couple quick examples. Having a discussion forum on your LMS where you have these questions to ask at different stages is a good idea. Putting the text of the reading into something like a Google Doc and then having everybody annotate it together is another option that you have. So there's a lot that you can do with different web tools and with learning management systems that can make the intensive reading lesson a little more lively, a little bit more interesting and engaging, rather than having everyone feel like they're isolated all the time. And one last thing that I might mention is that you might want to anticipate how students are going to react to the text and think about how you can use that. Because as I said earlier, intensive reading is work reading. So sometimes it's going to be boring and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's going to be vital. In my case, I'm teaching an intensive reading class sometimes where my students in other classes or later years, they need to do research papers. So they need to look at some examples of English research. And if I don't consider that at all, then it sort of limits what I can do to help them in that sense. So you're going to come across those ideas yourself, certainly. How can you make that work in a way where maybe it doesn't feel as tedious, or they really appreciate what they're learning in that activity, is something that I recommend that you actively think about. So that's like the quick rundown of what it might mean to design an intensive reading lesson. If you look at the books that I shared with you earlier, the Gray Flotel, I can never remember the person's last name, or the Hedgecock and Ferris, they're going to have recommendations in those books for different types of activities that you can do. So they go a lot more in depth in comparison to what this presentation has right here. And then even that Lumen Learning website that I flashed at you all earlier, which I'll put up again one more time here. This page here is taken from a larger course called English Composition 1 that they put together. So if you click on the main link here, and hopefully it will load soon. There we go. Then we have this like great table of contents for other websites on this kind of topic, reading strategies for vocabulary, for example, or something more advanced like being able to support claims. There's a lot that is going on here that can be useful depending on your class, which maybe you can share it with your students, which is something I do. Or maybe you could just get ideas from this to design your lessons if this is a little bit more complex, okay? So yeah, that's the quick rundown. I have a question up here that I'm going to answer. Your presentation seems focused on how teachers should teach intensive reading and student reactions. Suggest some intensive reading for undergraduate and graduate students. Do you mean strategies for intensive reading there? So as far as strategies go, I think like the quick answer, because we only have so much time to discuss this, would be to sort of take a look at what a website like this has to offer and try to use some of those strategies yourself. So like I teach at an undergraduate university. I want my students to be able to do source analysis in all my classes. In an intensive reading class, this allows me to do some reading writing connections to sort of learn more about those sources. So having students do a crap analysis, that's not my acronym. I didn't make that up, but it is actually a pretty famous one for currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose, is sort of like an automatic strategy I want my students to do. So when I introduce it to them, I might get them to consider that in both their before and during readings. So before you read, guys, check out the website that I'm sharing with you to make sure it is timely, check the dates. To make sure it is relevant, check the subject, and so on. So a lot of these different strategies and tools that you see up here are things I'm going to try to incorporate into the stages if I'm doing an intensive reading lesson. And there's this website, but if you go to the core lumenlearning.com, it's not just English Composition 1, but also like other classes. I'm trying to find the right link right now, and I might need to access it a different way. If you go to this website, you could find other classes like different English levels and other subjects as well. So I would recommend checking out all these different things that you think is something worth having your students practice, and think about how does that fit into the stages that I've discussed up to this point. I hope that answered your question pretty well. Did anybody else have a question or a follow-up to that? So you'd like to have a list of all the websites. One thing that I can do right now is just start posting that into the chats. So that way I can do this while I'm talking, so nobody has to stay for this. But I'll just sort of start posting these items into the chat itself, so that way people can take those. A lot of these were Wikipedia links, so I don't know if you guys want those as much, but I'll like have that in there as well. And then later, this will be available online, I believe, so people can access in that way as well. But yeah, I'll just start posting that into the chat. And if anybody else has another question, I'll just be ready to see that if it pops up. And if you guys have any commentary on the on this as well, I'm all ears.
Taught a very similar kind of course the last 2 semesters at my university, and basically the whole point was to get students to read quickly at various kinds of texts. They're English majors, but they are expected to be able to like kind of approach kind of like authentic sort of academic or kind of semi-academic texts by the time they're in their final year of university.
Yes.
And so I took a kind of discourse analysis heavy approach to it, just not so much to kind of get them used to discourse analysis, but more like the strategies there can help. So things like looking at theme and ream so that they don't get lost with pronoun use and things like that. I found it really useful for my students, and they did too.
So it's like systemic functional
linguistics
you're mentioning there a little bit, right?
Yeah, so this kind of thing, but it's like not pointing them towards any like SFL kind of textbooks or anything, just a couple of things in there. Now I have a link on my blog to my first semester courses materials. They're open for use. It's an OER. You can download a PDF or an editable Word file if anybody's interested. I can post that in the chat.
Sure, that'd be great. We do have to stop the presentation in a moment here. They kind of wanted us to like be on a little bit of a tight ship. Mark, thank you very much for sharing that. I'll be like more than happy to check it out myself. When it comes to, if you have more questions about this, guys, you can find me at dehondg@gmail.com. Normally, L2 writing, discourse analysis, and digital affordances are things that I focus on as a researcher and also as a teacher. But I do have some familiarity with like other things in terms of reading theory for L2 learners in case you just want more resources or ideas. Guys, thank you for taking part in this presentation. Mark, thank you for sharing that link with us. And enjoy your conference, guys. Stay happy, stay healthy. And thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Cheers to you. Thank you. Did anyone else want to ask any quick questions or need to know anything before I close the meeting?
Do you post this on, this is all recorded, right?
This is being recorded right now.
Being recorded,
so,
yes.
Okay. This is being recorded to the Cotisol cloud. I don't know when it's available yet. If you check with the people monitoring the conference, they'll give you that kind of information. And you know, if you just want my PPT, I can send it to you as an attachment if you send me an email or something like that. Again,
yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, I was walking, and so I couldn't walk and listen very well at the same time.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, so I was missing out a little bit, but I was trying to listen as much as I can. But it was really insightful. And
so if you email me at dehondg@gmail.com, you'll be able to just ask me any other questions, and I can just also give you PPT.
Great. Let me record this right now on my browser before you close this.
Okay.
Yeah, at gmail.com. Okay, great. I got you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Garrett. Thank you.
Take care. Anybody else want to ask a quick question or anything?